Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at some takeoff tips. These are going to be things just to make it a little bit easier to get in the air as well as, do it safely. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first things first, and this is one of those little subtle takeoff tips that people really miss, and that's making sure you utilize the entire runway for the purposes of takeoff. Now, one of the things that Flight Sim does very poorly here is when you do kind of do these auto spawns, it'll actually put you down a pretty good amount of the runway. Now, this is a very short runway. Talking at about 1,800 feet here at its best length, which means if we're giving up 100 feet there, that could be potentially very hazardous to us, especially if it was a very hot day. The next thing we're going to take a look at, of course, is wind. Now, this is one of those things where people think they got it, but they probably missed it. And one of the things we're always going to be interested in as a pilot or as a salesperson as well is knowing which way the wind is coming from. Now, in Flight Sim, there's a lot of ways to determine this. We could go find the windsock, in which case, as you can see, because it's not in 3D, it's relatively difficult to identify which runway it's pointing towards, which would be the favored runway. Or we could, of course, check our ATIS, we could check local weather reports, or we could even set the wind ourselves. Now, one of the mistakes people make is they just go. They have their favorite little runway, they come zipping out onto it, and go ripping down without paying much heed to this lovely little sock here. So let's go ahead and open up the wind settings here. We're currently facing to the runway 19er right now. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that. I'm going to twist that wind around real quickly here. Of course, 19ers in that direction, not that direction. If I go park it over there, you can see my windsock is facing me perfectly. This would be an optimum situation for takeoff purposes. But there's other things that the windsock is going to tell you. One thing I can notice, for example, is the fact that the windsock is dancing. It's not simply pointing in one direction. A dancing windsock tells us an awful lot about what the wind is doing. In this case, you can see the wind can't make up its mind how fast it wants to blow. The other thing we can tell from looking at the windsock is what the gusts are doing. Do we notice the wind stays in the same direction? Do we notice that the wind is shifting in direction rapidly? Those are all things that are going to give us a huge clue as to what our takeoff experience is going to be like. So let's go ahead and create a little bit of gust here, just to make things a little more interesting for us. We'll go ahead and create that's a pretty low gust here. We'll make it a 5-knot gust here. Yeah, that should be pretty dramatic and make my point pretty clearly. Nice. So you can see, for example, here that this is 10-knot wind, and you can notice that the wind sock itself can't seem to make up its mind which direction it wants to travel in. You also notice that the wind sock itself is kind of doing a little happy dance here where it can't quite decide how fast it's going. This is a very hazardous situation for us and will have a big impact in what we're actually going to be doing when we get in the air, which is why it's so critical that even though we know what the wind is, maybe electronically, that we take a quick little peek at this guy because it's a really helpful tool for us. So let's go ahead and head back to those gusts real quick, and I'm going to adjust them just a tiny bit. Actually, I'm just going to cancel out the gusts completely. Then we'll go up to the gust is good. Let's go ahead and bring the gust wind back in here. We'll bring out 5-6 knots. It's pretty reasonable. And we'll go ahead and make it a nice, lovely crosswind. The other thing we know from the windsock, and again, this is another one of those takeoff considerations, is what we're likely to expect on takeoff. For example, I noticed the fact that my sock is going like this, which means the wind is going to be coming from this direction, which means two things. First of all, that the plane is going to be pushed to the left as, of course, the wind is pushing it. However, we also know that the plane's nose is going to pull into the direction of the wind because of the weather vaning effect of our airfoil. So let's go ahead and take off directly here. I'm not going to do anything special with this takeoff. I'm basically just going to hit the power and enjoy my journey here. So again, I'm not doing anything, but notice that the plane is pulling into the wind here. Now, if I didn't quickly compensate for that, we would have been right off the edge of the runway, and that could have ended terribly. Now, once I get myself up in the air here, you can see that I've immediately had to bring myself over to the right. You can also see as I got myself in the air here that I'm kind of struggling to pick up a lot of speeds because I've made several mistakes already in my journey to get myself into the air. Now imagine if for a second here that if maybe it was a little bit low visibility, maybe it was nighttime, that could have been a very messy takeoff for us. So let's go back and take another look at it. All right, we've got everything all nice and reset, and we're ready to do this a little bit more carefully this time. So we kept the wind the same. We're coming out of the right. We know that it is a gusting wind. How do we know? Because the sock is going up and down here. A gusting wind means that we need to use a slightly higher takeoff speed than we normally would. Now, in this particular aircraft, it's super duper easy. Basically, we run up to the red line there, about 42 knots. We're going to go ahead and give it a little tug and just a little bit of back pressure on this thing to get airborne. Now, the one question, of course, we can ask ourselves is, do we need to use flaps or not use flaps on this particular run here? For our purposes, you can see Flight Sim starts us at one click of flaps, but there's nothing stopping us from streamlining our flaps as well because we have plenty of room to take off And this is a very, very lightweight airplane. So what we're going to do in this takeoff is a couple things. So one thing we're going to do is we're going to confirm that our aileron that is at the wind is going to be held up. This is going to help ground this wing down into the ground. We've talked about this in previous videos, but this is a really critical component of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it to the right, and then as it gains power, I'm going to slowly back that out. That's going to be the first thing that I'm going to do differently here. The second thing I'm going to do differently is I'm going to leave the plane on the ground slightly longer than recommended. A lot of times when you're doing a takeoff, like I said, about 41, 42, you can give it a tug. I'm going to wait until 45 before I give it a tug. The advantage to this, of course, now is I will have better control authority. And if I have a gust suddenly cut out on me, that means I still have 3 or 4 knots over the speed that I need to safely get myself at. So let's go ahead and try combining those two factors together to see if that improves things a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and take my controls, stick them over to the right there. Go ahead and release the power. I'm going to go ahead and smoothly increase it. There's that initial climb, and we'll go ahead and do this. So now as I'm ripping down the runway, I'm just backing up my ailerons gently. There's 40, 45. We're just going to give it a little tug, and we are airborne. Once we're in the air, of course, for this particular aircraft, we're going to get the wheels out of the way, and we're going to start getting ourselves a nice little climb out. Again, this is a very, very high-performance small airplane here, so it really, really, really gets going in a hurry. But what you probably observe with that takeoff is that we were able to keep the plane much more controlled. The one thing you probably also observed with the takeoff is once the aircraft got into the air, it was a very abrupt launch into the air. That was not a smooth transition in any way. It was basically this as soon as we could get up into the air. That is a very dangerous and very uncomfortable situation. And one of the problems with a lot of us, of course, because of the way our joysticks are set up at home, is we don't have that millimeter of pressure. Well, obviously, millimeter is not a unit of pressure. You don't have that super fine control that you would have in a conventional yoke. So let's head back to the ground and add some more details here. All right, we're ready to rock. So now we can take a look at the next aspect of controlling this aircraft and getting us safely into the air. And that's what we do after the plane gets in the air. Now, all aircraft, when you actually read the POH under the amplified procedures, a lot of times they'll say something like lift the nose wheel, and that's what they give you for advice to actually get in the air. So one of the strategies that some people like to do is they actually like to hold their stick back a little bit to basically lift the nose wheel and let the nose wheel come into the air right away. Now, that's going to give us some really, really big problems in our crosswind situation because one of the things keeping us straight is going to be that nose wheel. Now, this aircraft has a gigantic rudder on it compared to the rest of the kind of control surfaces on here, meaning if we're moving fast enough, hypothetically, we might be able to maintain positive directional control if we do something like that. So let's go ahead and demonstrate kind of what's going to happen if we try to play that game. So I'm going to go like this, a little back. I'm going to hold it over to the right like we did for the previous takeoff. So I've got a little bit of back pressure on it, and I've also got that right aileron going on here. All we're doing this time is we're just holding the nose off the ground. See how it came up right away? Now notice the plane comes airborne on its own, but notice all that slipping action that I just had to do in order to keep this aircraft up there. So as you can see with that particular maneuver, even though we were able to maintain more or less positive control because we had such a big rudder on this thing, you could see the fact that we basically did a power wheelie and jumped up into the air kind of towards the end there. The upside to that, of course, is if we're on grass or something like that, we would have been fine. But if we were on an aircraft with a smaller rudder, we would have been in a really bad spot because as soon as that front wheel got out of the ground, we would have a really tough time maintaining that lateral direction of control to get us safely down the runway. So maybe that strategy doesn't work either. So let's go ahead back. All right, so now we know a couple different things here. First of all, again, we're dealing with the crosswind here. With the headwind, some of these things are going to be different. So there's a couple things that work really, really well for us. We've discovered that keeping the ailerons in the direction of the wind made a big difference. We also discovered that if we pull back a little bit too early, that could put us in kind of an awkward spot as far as lateral control goes. But we also know that we need a little bit of extra speed before we get into the air. So how do we combine all those things into one super smooth motion so that we can get safely airborne without having to basically be warring with the controls? Well, that's where our piloting comes in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do a couple things here. We're going to go ahead and use our aileron in the direction of the wind like we did before. We're not going to put any back pressure on the stick until we reach into the white zone of our aircraft's speed. Now keep in mind we have no flaps deployed, so the white zone here theoretically is not for loading and unloading only. It's going to basically be not getting us airborne, except now we have ground effect. So because we're so low to the ground, even though we're not in our we can go flying speed, anything in those 30 to 35 to 40 mile an hour range, or not range, I should say, in this particular one, is still going to be enough to get us to hop. And we don't want to hop. That's going to be very, very dangerous for us. So what we're going to do is that we're going to go ahead and tap this to the right. Again, I got my right aileron. I'm neutral in the elevator. I'm going to go ahead and kill the parking brake here. And one thing I'm going to do a little differently this time is I'm going to gently build up speed. I'm not going to just ram on it like I did before. What I'm going to do now is as we're running down the runway, I'm going to start pulling back just whoops, and now we get ourselves into the air. Now notice the difference there. We basically started accelerating. I maintained positive lateral control all the way down the runway, and I was able to get this thing to rotate relatively smoothly without any difficulties. Now some people say, okay, so that's pretty cool, but that required a lot of fancy footwork. That required a lot of aileron work. You really had to be on top of it. I did not realize this is how challenging these aircraft were to fly. Is there a cheating way to do it? There is, but I don't necessarily recommend it. Now, one of the nice things we have at our disposal in this airplane, which is super handy, is we have elevator trim. Now, for those of you not familiar with this, it basically allows us to remove control pressures. You're sitting there going, you're not seriously going to do that. And I'm going to say, yeah, I seriously am going to do that. So one of the things we've done so far is we've taken off using just our little stick here. But what would happen if we were to take our pitch trim and back it up just a little? And again, that was not much of a pitch trim change. So what I'm going to do is a standard takeoff, but I'm not going to touch the elevator control. Let's see what happens. Again, we're going to go ahead and put our ailerons into the wind. We're going to start accelerating. And all we're going to do is we're going to let that little notch of trim get us airborne. Now notice we're at our speed. Oh, and now we're airborne. I have not done any of this action. The trim on the aircraft got us airborne. Now there's a lot of problems with that. Of course, if you set it incorrectly by a millimeter, that means the aircraft will not get itself airborne smoothly. You'll be over or you'll be under on speed. Likewise, as you probably observe with this little action that it did at the last second there, that was because of the fact that I had the aileron over so far because I'm concentrating so much on my approach speed. Of course, if our center of gravity was different, if the weather was different, if the wind were different, all those factors would mean that that cool little fun takeoff that I just executed would now be kind of garbage. I would have sucked up more runway, maybe I would have rotated too soon. All those problems would have been created because I didn't give it that little bit of boost at the end. But I cannot overstate this enough. Setting your trim correctly really makes this whole process better. Now there's one more detail that we're going to have to get right on our takeoff here. And that's going to be what we're going to be doing after takeoff. Now that's one of those things where in a real plane, depending on what you set the trim to, after you get the plane in the air, you might find yourself pulling 60 pounds of force with one hand, trying to keep the nose even above the horizon, depending on what your trim and your speed is. But for us in flight sim, moving the controls back I can't do that in a real plane once we're moving kind of a thing like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take off again, and we're going to be a little more observant on what we need to do when we get in the air. Now remember, when you're dealing with passengers, it's going to be a slightly different experience because passengers really don't like high cabin angles. It's absolutely terrifying. Ideally, we only want to be holding 6 or 7 degrees above the horizon for the purposes of our initial climb out. So what we're going to do is combine everything we've done so far, but this time, as soon as the aircraft gets going into the air, I'm simply going to release the back pressure on the stick. We're racing. I'm going to slowly back up that aileron there. Just like we did before, we're going to get to 45, we're going to give it a little tug, and I'm just going to push the nose forward. Now notice here that we're holding at about 7.5 degrees. I'm going to bring up the landing gear. Obviously, we're not getting much more. And you can see all I'm doing is basically balancing us into the wind here, keeping it at that magical angle there. It's going to be basically getting us a nice, smooth, not too steep angle as we start climbing. Now the interesting thing is, because of the way the trim was set for takeoff, if I let go of my controller, you'll notice the plane starts nosing up very, very aggressively, and we start speeding down, which is important because although it got us in the air safely, we still have to take a moment to trim it out for the actual climb experience so that once that's set, I can go ahead and let go of everything and enjoy the scenery of this kind of early Saturday morning in October, kind of a thing like that. So hopefully there's some takeaways, if I can speak English, that is. A couple takeaways. The big thing here is trim makes a big difference as far as takeoff. The next thing we want to keep in mind is making sure our ailerons are into the direction of where the wind is coming at. Other thing, of course, that we saw too was even though I did not use takeoff flaps on this, the presence of a gusting crosswind meant that I had to use a slightly higher speed on the ground in order to be able to safely get airborne in case the gust caught out on us. And of course, that last piece, which was also fairly important, is once you do get into the air, it's really critical that you get the cabin angle to something that's a little more reasonable, unless, of course, you're trying to avoid some kind of obstacle. Enjoy.